Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 4, Political Ideas and Ideologies. Take a moment to have a look at this image. It's true, you know. Some important admin quickly. Please make sure you use the Political Studies essay templates. I have talked about this quite a lot, and you're probably sick of hearing me say it, but I say it because it's important, so that's why I'm emphasizing this. Please make sure you do use that. Secondly, again, a repetition, if you haven't received an email from Turnitin for my unit, please let me know ASAP so I can give you access. Don't tell me the night before your assignment is due, okay? There's a 24-hour turnaround time on Turnitin, so it'll be too late by then, and your essay will be late. Remember, it's minus 5% per day late, so that's a problem. So, the next point is, if you still want to join the Monash Society of Political Dialogue and Analysis, please do so. The link is in one of the first lectures and from the first class in week 1. Please do that. It is a good opportunity for you to network and also find out about different things you could do as a career, etc., etc. There's so many things you could do in that society, so please join. Remember that the test is taking place in week 4, Friday the 21st of March. Please keep checking Moodle for updates with regard to the venue and the exact time, which might probably be between 2 and 4. It is a 2-hour test, but that still has to be confirmed, so keep checking. Please see the scope under the Assessment tab on Moodle, and do not spot, please. The scope will give you guidance as to what to focus on for the learning, but don't spot because you're going to lose marks unnecessarily. So my suggestion to you is not to learn the textbook like a parrot, but to rather use my notes as the backbone or skeleton and then flesh out using the textbook. The terminology sheet is also important for the test, just like the terminology test you took a couple of weeks ago. So please make sure you learn all of that content. Just check out the scope and it gives you everything there. Also, those of you guys who are in the Wednesday 9 o'clock TUT, please remember that there won't be a physical TUT for you on the 21st, Human Rights Day, so you have to participate in the online forum. That will count as your tutorial attendance. So it's important that you do that. And you also have to submit your annotated bibliography to me under my office door, C213 in Building C, by the Thursday the 22nd of March, in order for that to count. Right. Okay, let's start. What do you guys believe in? If I was in class with you right now, I would show you these images and ask you guys to explain a bit about what you think they mean. For example, what is this? Me, myself. Do you think about yourself as the individual the most important thing in your life? Do you care about others? Are you concerned about the social community around you and socialization and those living with disabilities and social grants and those kinds of things? Are you a person concerned with achieving in life? Is that your key aim? Are you a person who's worried about your future in terms of your employment, for example, or your career, your advancement in life, your general quality of living, housing, basically socioeconomic conditions? Linked to that, are you a person who cares about issues with the rich and the poor? Are you concerned about inequality? And the massive level of inequality in South Africa, for example. Do you care about green stuff? And by green stuff, I don't mean money. I mean the environment. Are you concerned about what we're doing to the environment as humans on the planet? Do you care about women's rights? Do you think that there's too much patriarchy in the world still today? Are you concerned about the advancement of women in society and career choices and employment opportunities, etc.? And in politics, of course. Those are all called ideologies, basically. So that's an introduction to this section, because the outcome for this section, the outcomes are, by the end of it, you should be able to define what political ideology is. You should be able to explain the key ideas and theories of the major ideological traditions, and you should be able to explore non-Western trends in ideology also. So let's start with what is political ideology. If you have a moment, have a look at the crash course video. The link is here, but it's also on YouTube under week 4. Then take a look at this image below. This is called the ideological spectrum, so you might have seen this before somewhere. It's also called the left versus right political spectrum, so what you're looking at is ideologies that go from the left all the way to the right. You might have heard, for example, of people referring to the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, as being leftist, because they would be on the left side of the ideological spectrum, whereas maybe the DA or the ANC might be a little bit more in the middle because they have to appeal to a few more people than the EFF, which is quite radical in its views. Other examples in society might be like the Conservative Party in the UK. That would be more towards the right on the political spectrum. So this is what we understand by the ideological spectrum. If you look at the very, very, very far left, the left wing, where anarchism is, this idea is to abolish all government. Basically, that's the idea. That's the furthest on the left you can get. Then communism, then socialism, and as we move towards the middle of the ideological spectrum, we see those aspects more related to freedom, like liberalism, some aspects of conservatism, but then we're going more towards the right now. So here you have monarchism, and then Nazism, and then fascism, which is sort of on the very far right wing of the ideological spectrum. Have a look at the terminology at the bottom of the far left and the far right. Somebody, whoever wrote this image, has said that the far left constitutes slavery, and the far right also constitutes slavery. Now that's something that we could talk about. If we were in class, we would do that right now, but you can also use the forum. If anybody's interested, the elephant there refers to what party in America? Does anyone know? It's the Republican Party. The donkey refers to the Democrats. Right, continuing with understanding what is political ideology, David McClellan refers to the following definition. He says, ideology is the most elusive concept in the whole of the social sciences, but it basically consists of three elements. 1. It's a political belief system. Political ideas that embody or articulate class or social interests also form ideology. An ideology is also an abstract and highly systematic set of political ideas. All of those constitute an overarching definition of ideology. And ideology also functions in terms of three things. So what's the point of ideology, or your sort of worldview on something? It's supposed to provide you with a perspective in understanding the world. So, for example, if you are a liberal, you're going to understand it in a certain way. If you are a Marxist, you're going to understand it in a certain way, etc., etc. Ideology also shapes political systems. It also acts as a social cement between groups. In the social scientific sense, we're looking at ideology as a coherent set of ideas. That's important, everybody, so sort of highlight that. A coherent set of ideas which provide a basis for organized political action. And there are three central features in terms of ideology in the social scientific sense. 1 refers to this idea of an account of existing power relationships or a worldview, sort of what I referred to before as your paradigm, how you see the world. Secondly, it's a model of a defined future, in other words, how you see the future. A vision of the so-called good society, what would make the best society, basically. And different ideologies have different perspectives on what the good society actually is for them. It's also an outline of how political change can and should be brought about. Now, there are competing definitions on what the nature of ideology is really all about. Marxists, for example, have a sort of scientific approach to ideology in their analysis of the class struggle. Liberals look at this whole idea of an open society where they permit and insist on, in fact, free debate and opposition and criticism. And then conservatives don't subscribe to an ideology necessarily. They say that conservatism is a dispensation or attitude of mind, for example. So there are different ways that different people view, or different groups of people view, a definition of ideology. There's also a whole debate on the end of ideology, and this notion of, for example, if anybody remembers history from high school possibly, the whole end of the Cold War. So you've got 1989, 1990, and you've got the end of the Cold War, and this realization that communism has failed and democracy has won. So Francis Fukuyama wrote about this notion of the end of history because he said that liberal democracy had won, and therefore there was no more clash of ideology, basically, because democracy had won. So the liberals had won. Now that's something you could possibly discuss in the forum. It's very interesting debates. Right, let's focus on the first of our major ideologies, liberalism. The key aspects here are individualism, freedom, reason, equality, toleration or tolerance, consent and constitutionalism. Now this ideology is normally associated with the industrialized West. That's not to say that other countries can't be liberal. I mean, South Africa, for example, has many liberal aspects to it, all right, and we're considered a developing country and we're definitely not in the West. But the point is that it's mostly characterized with the liberal West. And there are two key aspects to liberalism, classical liberalism and modern liberalism. Now, under classical liberalism, this whole idea or ideology is a commitment to an extreme form of individualism where the individual is key. It's all about self-seeking and self-reliant individuals. They also believed in negative liberty, this notion of non-interference by the state. The state is only a necessary evil because it imposes collective will on the population and also limits individual power. And it has to, because if it didn't, then people would just abuse each other. It's this whole reference to Thomas Hobbes and the state of nature. But the notion really is that there should be a minimal state and that the focus should be on the individual, and the individual looks out for him or herself, for example, and the state should basically butt out. That's the whole idea of classical liberalism. If we move more into modern liberalism, though, that is characterized by a far more sympathetic attitude towards state intervention. And here we're moving towards a positive liberty, not a negative liberty, as the classic liberalists would say. Here we're looking at a positive liberty, which is linked to this idea of personal development and flourishing of the individual. Have a look quickly at this image on the side here. Social welfare or welfare liberalism is important because it protects individuals from these so-called blights. In this image here, blights, want, ignorance, disease, squalor, and idleness. This came out in the 1942 Beveridge Report, looking at the 5 giants in society that need basically taking care of, and that is want, ignorance, idleness, squalor, and disease. So that's how it links to this image on the 5 giants here. Our second major traditional ideology is conservatism, and the key ideas here are tradition, pragmatism, human imperfection, organicism, hierarchy, authority, and property. 2 key aspects to consider would be paternalistic conservatism, which is linked to the idea of compassionate conservatism, and is consistent with the ideas of hierarchy and duty. This little image on the side here is a picture of Disraeli, and he spoke about the one nation principle as the idea of paternalistic conservatism. Reform basically is preferable from above, he said, rather than from below. So it's about basically the state acting like a parent and controlling everything that goes on in society for the benefit of the people. That's the notion. So the new right, though, comes along and criticizes this a bit and says the new right can be traced back to the 1970s, and it's born out of this whole apparent failure of Keynesian social democracy. But that's only certain people's view of it. You don't have to necessarily agree if you don't want to. But there were concerns about social breakdown, and so the new right basically spoke about this notion of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. This idea that we mustn't have a nanny state, there should be free economy. And so there's competition in the market competition basically. We can't have a state controlling absolutely everything like a parent, as they would have it in the paternalistic conservatism. They said no to that. But they said rather we should have neoconservatism as well, where you return to traditional values and you have government regulation and you have a strong state, and the state basically takes care of the population, but not to the degree that the paternalistic conservatives would like. So again, you can decide whether or not you believe in this notion of conservatism, and these are only some aspects that I've drawn attention to here. Obviously, it's a good idea to go and check out the textbook. Right, the next major ideology is socialism. The key ideas here are around community, fraternity, social equality, need, social class, common ownership, etc. Now, as you can read here on the slide, socialism developed really as a reaction to industrial capitalism, and it was associated with the idea of the interests of the growing working classes being more important than the individual, in the case with liberalism, or than the state, in the case of conservatism. So its goal was to establish the capitalist market economy and replace it with a society constructed on the basis of common ownership or collective ownership. Now, there are many strands of socialism, as I mentioned in week 1, and they range all the way from classical Marxism through to orthodox Marxism and then neo-Marxism, and then through to social democracy, on the one side, and that's more like what South Africa is, for example. But classical Marxism, for example, would be discussions around capitalism being doomed to failure and leading to this notion of dictatorship of the proletariat, whereas orthodox Marxism is more like Leninism and Stalinism and this idea of collectivization. Alright, so have a look at the textbook around more explanations to do with socialism in general. Now, having discussed some of the key or major ideological traditions, let's look at other ideological traditions. The first one here is fascism. Now, fascism is basically a 20th century ideology that was an interwar phenomenon developing between World War I and World War II, basically. And the 2 key leaders of the idea around fascism would be Mussolini and Hitler. Now, Mussolini was the Italian dictator who was in power between 1922 and 1943. And he looked at, or he focused on, an extreme form of statism in Italy at that time, whereas Hitler used a Nazi dictatorship, and he was in power from 1933 until 1945, the end of World War II, and his focus was on Aryanism and anti-Semitism. Now, I'm not sure if you're all aware of what Aryanism is, but it's basically this idea that he believed at the time that the German people were a master race. This Aryan race was the master race, and they were destined for world domination. And then anti-Semitism refers to the notion of Jews being Jews, as in the Jewish religion, Jews being inherently evil, and there was a need to eradicate them, he thought, at this time. So these two key forms of ideology. Having looked at some of the main ideological traditions, let's look at some other ideological traditions. The first one we're looking at here is fascism. Now, fascism is a 20th century ideology, came about during the period between World War I and World War II, so it's an interwar phenomenon, basically, and it was basically led by two leaders in society, Mussolini and Hitler. Mussolini's dictatorship of Italy took place between 1922 and 1943, and he basically promulgated an extreme form of statism in Italy at that time, whereas Hitler followed a Nazi dictatorship model in 1933 to 1945 when he was in power. Of course, he died at the end of World War II when he shot himself, but his focus of fascism was on Aryanism, that is, this notion of the Aryan race being the master race, the German people at the time being the master race destined for world domination. And he also focused on anti-Semitism, this notion of Jews being inherently evil and the need to eradicate them. Right now, what's important about this is that neo-Nazism has resurfaced in recent decades in response to anxieties over multiculturalism and immigration issues, especially in Europe and in other countries where you see extremely far-right groups coming to power and being elected by the people, even though they have sentiments that are extremely sort of anti-immigrant and extremely aggressive in nature. But we do see this resurgence of this kind of feeling more and more these days, and that's a key thing to think about, perhaps also on the discussion forum, everyone. But the key themes around fascism are around struggle, this idea of leadership, power, heroism, and war, and those are all characteristics of the fascist kind of principle. I've got a couple of videos here at the bottom. These are not compulsory for you to watch, and they're not going to be tested, but if you are interested and want to know what people's perspectives were like about life in Hitler's Germany Part 1 and Part 2, have a look at these YouTube videos here below. Our next ideological tradition is anarchism. Anarchism basically means without rule, and the central theme of this ideology is that political authority in all of its forms, especially the state, is unnecessary and evil. What the people who are anarchists want is they want a stateless society. They want free individuals to be able to manage their own affairs. So basically it's a collaboration of liberal individualism and social communitarianism. So collectivist anarchists, they say that there's a capacity for social solidarity that is innate within humans. They say that it arises because we are inherently sociable and gregarious, and essentially we have cooperative natures as humans, and therefore we can survive without having the state tell us what to do. So you believe what you would like to believe, but these are what the anarchists think. And a modern thinker who thinks along these lines is Noam Chomsky, who's written quite a few provocative things around anarchy and the state. Okay, our next ideological tradition is feminism. Now, the first time feminism was advocated as a political theory was really with Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. And the underlying themes of feminism are around society being characterized by sexual or gender inequality, with a structure of male power and being the need for that to be overturned because it's entrenched in society, they say. And there are three kinds or streams of feminism: liberal feminism, socialist feminism, and radical feminism. The liberal feminists basically argue around the unequal distribution of rights and opportunities in society for women, and they argue that there's a need to improve career and education for women. Whereas socialist feminists refer to this idea of women being confined to family and domestic life, and what that means in terms of their prospects being limited or suffocated. And then the radical feminists are, as their name suggests, they're radical. So they talk about this notion of patriarchy. The sexual revolution is needed, they say. And the extreme form of radicalists talk about this idea of man being the enemy in all things. And that basically patriarchy inserts itself into every aspect of human life, including the family and education and career opportunities, the economy, politics, and they want that overturned. So they actually want a sexual revolution where women rise up and basically destroy the male hierarchy. I've got an article here at the bottom of the page, Patriarchy is Still a Major Challenge and Fight for Equality. Please have a look at this YouTube link and see what you think. I also posted something a while ago on women and patriarchy in South Africa, so it's interesting to see what you guys have said about that. Okay, let's move on now with our other ideological tradition, which is green politics. Before you look at these lines above, let's have a look at this image below. If you pull away from the screen a bit and look at it from further away, can you see the image of the person lying in the grass? There's the face with the eyeball and the hair. There's the neck and the shoulder, tracing all the way down to the arm and the rest of the body. I think this image is fantastic, showing this notion of this humanity and Earth being linked like this. It's actually fantastic. But the point behind green politics, also known as ecologism, is that it reflects the damage we are doing to the natural world through economic development, through nuclear technology, etc. As a result of all of those progressive sort of developments, we now have acid rain, ozone depletion, global warming, etc. And green politics is an alternative to anthropocentric or human-centered stances on ideologies, because all the others are anthropocentric. They have a human-focused stance, the other ideologies. But this one has an ecocentric view, with humans simply being a part of wider nature. So humans are just part of this. And really, the main advocate of this is the Gaia hypothesis by James Lovelock. Here's a YouTube video that you can link to that basically explains all about the Gaia hypothesis. But just basically in short, Gaia looks at this notion of the planet being a living organism, and that we are just a part of this living organism, human beings. We are not central to it, we are just part of this wider organism. And it says also, it's just interesting because ecologists, extreme ecologists, sometimes referred to as deep ecologists, place the ecosystem before human needs. And they say that the planet should be looked after before humans are, which you can debate yourself if you want to. But perhaps the appeal should be to self-interest and common sense amongst individuals, that if we don't take care of the planet, there won't be a planet anymore for us to live on. So we can't be the focus. We have to start focusing on the planet and being sort of an interactive and cohesive organism with the planet at the same time as human beings. This is interesting because green politics can also be expressed through other ideologies as well. For example, ecofeminism is an ideology, and ecofeminism looks at males being less sensitive than females to the natural world. I don't know if you think that's true, guys. Maybe you can also discuss that on the forum. But it's just important because some ideologies do cross over into other ideologies too. And this is a classic example of that with ecofeminism. Another ideological tradition is cosmopolitanism. Now, cosmopolitanism is also split into sort of four key areas. The first one being moral. This notion that the world is basically a single moral community, so people basically have obligations towards other people, regardless of the religion that they have. So really the notion here is that it's commonly inserted through the doctrine of human rights, basically internationally, kind of like belief in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and that kind of thing. Whereas liberal here, their focus is on universal civil and political rights and also economic rights, this notion of a universalized market society, where there's wider individual freedom and people can engage in that market freely in an individual way if they'd like to. But there's also this notion of universal civil and political rights, that there's a support for humanitarian intervention and international law to ensure civil and political rights. There's also a social aspect to cosmopolitanism with a quest for social justice. And then cultural, this idea that we're all basically global citizens and so we're all interconnected on this global level. Now let's start with some really interesting non-Western ideological trends, the first of which is post-colonialism. Now just some context here. As the West developed, intellectually and culturally, it obviously began to export its political ideologies to the rest of the world and apply Western ideas in non-Western states. Now, clearly this was not always welcome. That's why you had an Arab nationalism coming up against Western ideology. You also had tribal views coming up against Western ideology. Because it entangled obviously with indigenous values and ideas and ways of life. Julius Nyerere from Tanzania, he had an interesting comment to make. He said, "We have no more real need to be converted to socialism than we have of being taught democracy." And I think that's a very interesting comment as well. But really the notion of post-colonialism was an idea around giving non-Western states or the non-Western world a political voice that was separate from liberalism and socialism. And it was really proffered in the early days by the Third World, or the Third World perspective, in the Bandung Conference of 1955 with the non-aligned movement. And this was basically a formation of 29 African and Asian countries led by Egypt, Ghana, India, and Indonesia. Now, obviously, last week we spoke about the notion of the three worlds, and the first, second, and third world, and that it's derogatory to talk about the third world existing. So at the time, it was referred to as the third world offering, this non-aligned movement. But now we would refer more to the developing world. Now, this is interesting as well, everybody. Even within this ideology, there are disparate views or different views on how post-colonialism should actually be. For example, Gandhi was basically a pacifist, and he said that it should be about non-violence and how we should sort out our views through non-violence, through dialogue, and through peaceful discussion. Whereas Fanon, for example, spoke about the need for absolute violence. He spoke about the notion of colonial rule being this psychopolitical level between whites and blacks, and this can only be cut or destroyed through absolute violence. So you can see here that there are also disparate views on what post-colonialism should mean to people and for people. Another non-Western ideological trend is religious fundamentalism. Have a look at this image quickly. Now, Islamic fundamentalism has basically been around for a while, but has really come to the fore since in the late 1970s, really, with the Iranian Revolution of 1979, because the Iranian Revolution was the first time that the world had an Islamic state, with the leader being the Ayatollah Khomeini, and that was really when it really hit the scene in a big way. But the notion of Islamic fundamentalism is based on this idea of an intense and sort of militant faith, that Islamic beliefs override principles of social life and politics. That's the idea. And the state would then be based on Sharia law, which would have its fingers in all pies in the state, as it were. So it would control all aspects of society through religion, through Sharia law. This religious fundamentalism has been a vehicle for anti-Westernism, especially the imposition of permissive and materialist values, because there's always been this criticism from the religious fundamentalists that the West is very permissive and focused on materialism and materialist values. And so this kind of fundamentalism is a vehicle for anti-Western notions of these permissive and materialist values. And it's been characterized mostly by jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda, where their focus was on militancy and martyrdom and killing as a martyr. And then now, of course, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, also known as ISIS, also known as the Islamic State, and there has been very extreme forms of religious fundamentalism with beheadings, etc., filmed on YouTube for people to watch. So these are all examples of what we would refer to as religious fundamentalism as an ideology. Next up, under our non-Western ideological trends, are Asian values. Let's have a look quickly at these flags. Do you know where they belong? This is Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Now these are the four Asian tigers, and together with Japan, they basically fuel the notion of Asian values, right? Now, Asian values are not a rejection of any other kind of value, basically, like a rejection of universal human rights or something like that. It's a suggestion, really, of a vision of social harmony in society that's based on cooperation and grounded in loyalty, duty, and respect for authority. And a key characteristic of the Asian values would be Confucianism, with an emphasis on Ren, or family relationships, this humanity or love among family, and Junzi, which is the virtuous person. So it's a combination of Ren and Junzi, and it's a system of ethics formulated by Confucius, where the twin themes really are on human relations and cultivation of the self. So there you have Ren, human relations, and Junzi, the cultivation of the self. Right, our final non-Western ideological trend is beyond dualism. This whole point is the idea of the world being characterized by duality. In other words, absolute unity of opposites. Something either is or it isn't. This is a very typical Western view. It's either right or it's wrong. It's black or it's white. It is or it isn't, right? So beyond duality looks at the notion of setting aside this Western either-or thinking, where you split everything into two, like the mind versus the body, good versus evil, humankind versus nature, and instead looks at the notion of going beyond that duality beyond that split into favoring integration and oneness. And a key focus here would be Buddhism, where there's an aspect of intrinsic interdependence that is key. All right, so next week, make sure that you've read the chapter on democracy and legitimacy, because it's important. We'll be going over all of the key aspects of democracy and liberal democracy, etc., as well as the debate around who should vote and how old you should be when you vote, etc. So it promises to be quite an exciting debate. So please make sure you do that for next week. All right, that's it, everybody. Good luck. Make sure you learn the section for the test. It's in there.